Hi everyone, this is my response video. I'm going to do one of these every week as sort of a response to the work that you've handed in. And also it gives me the opportunity to go over one or two things each week that have sort of popped out to me that might be important so that we can carry them on as they go. First of all, I want to say thank you very much everybody that handed in work this week. I found it to be very high standard. This is one of the classes that I've taught quite a few times, so I've got a lot to compare your work to, and we have a really good class this time. So thank you if you handed something in, very considered, well considered work, almost without except, well, I'd say without exception. I think I can say that this time. So thank you very much for that. Keep this up over the course of the semester. It looks to me like you're getting out of the reading the things that I'd like you to get out of it, and that's great. So I'll make these videos each week. The first thing that I want to cover on this video is nationalism. That's popped up already, which is right for it to pop up at this point. And so I'd like to talk about the definition of nationalism, or at least a definition that I prefer to use, and I think that's a useful one for this class because it brings out some sort of interesting questions out of the other modules that we're going to encounter as we go forward. So, and it's this. It's quite a neutral definition of nationalism. I like to think a sort of a social science definition of nationalism, a very pared back idea of nationalism, which I think is, like I said, useful for us to use. And it goes something like this. Nationalism is basically the belief that people in the world are divided in a fairly significant way into nations. That's it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what gets added on to nationalism a lot of times when we think of nationalism, or we start talking a lot about ethno-nationalism, I think, recently in the world. But what I want to emphasize, right, is to sort of, when we say the word nationalism, let's divest it of a lot of these extras that get added on. And I'll talk about those extras that do get added on in a moment. But again, just to repeat myself really, nationalism is simply the belief or the assumption that people in the world are divided into nations, different cultures, and we'll talk about what constitutes a nation, I think, because that's an important aspect of nationalism. That the world is divided in that way, and that's significant, right? That's a significant division. I think one of the reasons why that's an interesting way to sort of think about nationalism for this class is that then the opposite of that, the negative of that, is that no, the world is not divided in a significant way into nations. Nations are insignificant. And then my question on that, it becomes, is that the assumption of globalization? Right? Is globalism in opposition to nationalism or not? And I'll explain that a little bit as well, but what I'm thinking with that. And I think for globalization or globalism, if we want to sort of put it in opposition to nationalism, would then have, at least as part of its definition, the idea that no, there's no significant divisions in the world. And that might lead us to thinking along the lines of a universalism, or maybe a humanism, right? Or universalism, that people are the same no matter what. And yes, we might have these things called nations, but they're not really a significant division. They don't really tell us anything about people, right? Either because people are all individuals and also different, right? Which would be maybe a very liberal individualist way of looking at it, or because that's not the deciding division. One sort of way to take that, right, is to go towards Huntington, which we read this week, right, and say, is this a rival to nationalism? Right? Is this idea of civilizational, right? The significant division for Huntington is not nation states, although in his writing he does hedge a little bit. Right? He does say, no, nation states are important, but what he wants to say is but the most important division in the world is not necessarily between different nations, but it's between these different cultures, right? And there's 5, 6, or 7 of these cultures, right? I think depending on, I think he doesn't decide it himself. So at least not finally. And he says, remember, he says that they can change. So are these cultures different from nations, right? So that's another way that we, if we're going to have Huntington's Clash of Civilizations as one possible division of the world, is that different from nationalism, right? And I think it might be, right? It might be. Okay, so again, this division of the world into nations, is that significant? Because I think with Huntington, he might say no. He might say, although again he hedges, but he might say, look, that was one historic division of the world. That was important at one point. Remember, at one point, the important division was between princes and kings. That was the important distinction. Which king did you serve? Then it became, I think, after that, nations and nation states with the French Revolution. Right? Which nation state are you a part of? Which nation are you a part of? That was historic for Huntington. And then it becomes ideology, right? Are you for the communists, right? Are you a communist or are you a liberal? Right? That's the next important division. And now we've moved on from that to civilizational distinctions. Right? And they're then different from national distinctions. And I think, again, we could argue that they are. In which case we might say, well, Huntington's then not a nationalist. And I think that would be a fair argument and an interesting discussion. Right? Is Huntington a nationalist? On the face of it, at least, I think he says that he's not. And so that nation states then become less significant than civilizational distinctions. But then what's a civilizational distinction? And he talks about, and a lot of you talked about this in your answers, right? That it seems heavily based on religion and religious differences. The other way that it's going to be interesting, we're going to talk about, I think I might, we're going to talk about Hindu nationalism in this class. So there's nationalism in the title, so we want to understand it. We're also going to talk about Trump. We're going to talk about populism as well quite soon. And so I'd like to distinguish, I think, between populism and nationalism. Those two things have been, I think, confounded a little bit in our national discourse, populism and nationalism, but I want to separate them by using this very specific and very defined definition of nationalism, that the significant division in the world is that between nations. Now, some of the stuff we add on to nationalism is we start to ask questions, well, if we do accept that, right, if we start by accepting the premise of nationalism that the world is divided into nations and that is a significant division, that means something to us, then we start to ask questions about, well, how are nations defined? How do nations come into being? And who, individuals, which individuals can be members of which nation? And how do we become part of a nation? And how do we distinguish between one nation and another nation? This additional question, which is an important one probably, but we can answer this in different ways. And then this is where we sort of get into some more controversial areas. So Johann Herder, I think that's his first name, his last name is definitely Herder, the German philosopher, was very interested in language as a source of nation. He's very much a romantic nationalist, and for him the source of nation is language. His argument is basically that, well, the languages that we speak, they enable for us to form our ideas and our ways of communicating about the world. Because all of the languages sort of do that in a slightly different way, sometimes very different ways, I suppose. When you speak other languages, it's oftentimes not a case of just finding this word, what's this word in another language. Sometimes you can do that, but oftentimes the phrases and the way that language goes together has a unique way of ordering the universe, right? So that we can't just simply translate our way, right? Our native way of translating the universe, of understanding the universe into a second language. Sometimes we can do that in a lot of different ways, but for Herder, not perfect. And so what he says is that this language difference is the cause of the difference in culture, right? Difference between in our way of looking at the world, and so that causes different nations. In more modern times, there's been ideas about, oftentimes we call it civic nationalism. Right? Oftentimes the idea behind civic nationalism is, hey, if you share our values, and if you become a citizen, perhaps, of the country, right? There's a sort of a conflation there of citizenship and nationality together. And this is very popular in the United States, right? This is, I think, a very American way of looking at nations. That, hey, the way that you become part of America is that you move here. Probably you accept our American values, right? Depending on whether you think that there are American values to accept. You'll come here, maybe it's the pursuit of happiness or something, or the pursuit of the good life, right? That's the American value, the American way, the American dream. And so if you have that American dream and you want to come here and look for that, then you become a citizen, and then you become part of the American nation that way, if there is an American nation. So that's a sort of very, very, very civic nationalist idea about how you get into a nation, or how you become part of a nation. Of course, there's also biological ideas, and racial ideas that are a lot less popular here than they might have been either in the past in Europe and in other parts of the world, where the idea of becoming part of a nation is really you're born into a nation, right? There's something physical in your makeup that makes you part of that nation, right? So these are different answers to the question of nationalism, right? If we are divided into different nations, then how does that division happen, right? So you can have nationalism, right? You can have nationalism without even answering any of those questions. But of course, it does ask that question, right? Of how do you become part of that nation? Another thing that gets added on a lot of times, and especially I think in our national discourse these days, a lot of things that gets added on to the idea of nationalism is an idea that I would probably call chauvinism, right? And the idea that our nation is better than those other nations, right? And of course, this comes out in the 20th century, the early 20th century probably, right? In Nazism in particular, right? This idea that one nation is destined to rule the other nations, right? Is more valuable or more worthy, right, of space and of land than these other nations, right? That's a much later addition to nationalism, much more dangerous, I think, in my opinion, right? Addition to and probably in a lot of people's opinions, right? It's not very controversial, I don't think, to say that the Nazis were dangerous, but that's their addition, right, to nationalism. And so I'd say, especially in this class, but I think generally as well, I think if we're going to be, certainly it's not that we can't talk about chauvinism, but I think it's worth, in this class, when we're going to talk about a relationship, I think, between nationalism and globalization, a little bit in this class, just know that when I'm saying nationalism, and oftentimes when these authors are saying nationalism, you should mostly assume that they're talking about this much more limited version of nationalism, right? There's just this basic idea that the world is divided into nations, and that's a significant division. Does globalization think that's significant? I think that's an important question for us to ask in this class, because if we're going to say, is nationalism with Trump, we're going to look at Germany as well. We're going to look at the United Kingdom Independence Party. I think that sort of nationalism, which those guys might be adding on a little bit to nationalism, but is nationalism altogether alien to globalization? Is Hindu nationalism, is it altogether alien to globalization? Or does globalization include a bit of nationalism, right? And one way that it might do that, if you can answer maybe yes to that question, right? One of the reasons you might answer yes to that question is that you might say, globalization is about hybridization. It's about taking from different cultures all over the place. different nations, right, all over this. Taking the best of each nation or something like that, or being able to include all nations through these sort of universal values that appeal to different nations. If it doesn't appeal to different nations, right, then it's not universal, maybe, right? And that's one view of globalization. Because the other one is that no, this is just westernization, right? Or to be nationalist about it, right? Americanization, right? We're just Americanizing the world. But notice that both of those interpretations of globalization, either the Americanization interpretation or the sort of universalization of world culture, the hybridization of world culture, they both depend on there being different, at least different cultures out there. Nation, right? We've talked about language, we've talked about sort of values, right? This sort of civic values, which in the United States might be to do with pursuing the good life, pursuing happiness, right? It might be to do with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And each nation, it might vary a little bit. Also, the idea of what happiness is might vary between nations. But even being able to say that, right, that cultural variance, the cultural diversity, once we start to accept the idea of cultural diversity, we're sort of in the realm there of nationalism, right? And so both of those conceptions of globalization, either the Americanization one, the concept is, hey, there's there's a distinct American nation, and there's other nations out there as well that are not American, but they're becoming more American, right? That has an element of nationalism in there, I think, at least a little bit. Then the other one is this, maybe as less of an idea of nationalism, but globalize, right? Globalize, the verb to globalize. If you think it doesn't mean Americanize, if we think it means actually to take something from different cultures, or to take something outside of culture, right? Technology and like universal values, human rights that at least we in the West, I think, right, take as beyond culture, outside of culture. And we take that beyond that, outside of culture, and make it and sort of globalize the event. It takes that thing outside of culture and brings it into cultures, right? And makes culture, sort of removes cultural differences, homogenizes the world, right? Like McWorld. Then again, we still have that idea of difference, right? This sort of similar, this sameness that we're going to sort of globalization is the imposition of this sameness. Or alternatively, it's the finding of this sameness in the different cultures and the enhancing of that sameness. Okay, so, but again, the fact that we can even talk about the sameness, again, that might underemphasize nationalism a little bit, but to think that we can, the sameness, the universal, is the part of each different culture that we can find that's the same, right? That still suggests that we need the difference in order to find the sameness. That's it's get a little bit philosophical, but I don't mind a little bit of philosophy now and again. All right, so there we are. I'm going to end this video, but I'm also going to make a second video, because what I promised, I think at the beginning, was to talk a little bit about the one thing I noticed in the readings, in the answers, is there was a lot of times that it would appear that appeared in the answers like, oh, they're similar, or they're dealing with similar things. And of course, I put them all together, right, into one module. So I think the same, that they're dealing with some similar question. And I think the question that they're dealing with, all of them, is, they're all from around the late 80s, beginning of the 1990s, at the fall of the Soviet Union, where they're looking forward and saying, what's the world going to be like? It's fun to read, because we're thinking, because we've seen it already. We're here, we're living in the world of the future. And so we can kind of see, well, which way has it gone? But one thing I want to do is emphasize some of the differences between them, because I did read a few times, oh, it's the same, oh, it's the same. Even though, like, some of you wrote, oh, the similarities, and then you went to list some of the really good distinctions between them, which was definitely a good way to answer the question. Even though that, I think, I want to emphasize the differences a little bit. That's what I enjoy doing. So again, that'll be on the second video, the instructor's response to for this week. So hope you found this useful. Let me know if you have any input or any questions about what I've said about nationalism here. Again, this is something that's going to pop up, I think, pretty much every week, this idea of nationalism. You're going to read nationalism in the readings quite a lot, and I think it's one of the questions I think about most in this class is, what's the relationship between nationalism and globalization?